When an animal trusts you, it creates one of the most incredible bonds in the world. That bond was what led a pack of wolves to guide a police patrol into a forest clearing one dark evening. What awaited them was horrifying. Jacob and his partner felt their stomachs turn as they took in the scene. The wolves, who had led them through the forest, stood just outside the clearing, howling in distress. Jacob's mind reeled. How could he have missed something so terrible happening within his own jurisdiction? Now that he knew, he was determined to take action. He had sworn to protect all who lived on this land, and this time he intended to keep that promise. But it hadn't always been that way for Jacob. Fresh out of the academy, he'd harbored big dreams of becoming a city cop, catching criminals in high-profile cases. So when he was assigned to a rural police station covering a vast, quiet county, he felt disappointed. This wasn't what he had envisioned for himself. Life in the countryside felt slow and uneventful compared to the bustling city life he'd imagined. He was disheartened by the lack of major crimes and worried he'd end up doing nothing more than routine patrols and paperwork. Over time, though, Jacob began to understand the unique role he played in this small community. His patrols were more than just routine. They connected him to the land and its inhabitants, both human and animal. He learned to notice the subtle changes in his surroundings and began to appreciate the natural beauty of the forests and fields he once dismissed as dull. The wolves, too, had become familiar faces, often spotted at the forest's edge, their eyes meeting his with a mutual, silent understanding. Now, as he stood in the clearing with the wolves by his side, Jacob felt that bond keenly. The animals had sensed his willingness to help and had guided him here, their trust a powerful testament to the connection he'd built over time. This horrific discovery weighed heavily on him, but it was also a call to action. Jacob was no longer just an officer dreaming of the city. He was a protector of this land and all its inhabitants, ready to defend it with everything he had. Becoming stationed in a rural village was the last thing Jacob wanted. When he first arrived, he was even more disheartened upon seeing the cabin he'd been assigned as part of his job, a small, isolated structure on the edge of a sprawling forest. To him, it felt like he was being exiled from the excitement and ambition of his career dreams. Yet, as he settled into his new life, an unexpected transformation took place. Jacob found himself captivated by the beauty of the land and the warm, welcoming people of the village. What began as reluctance turned into genuine affection, and he realized that helping people he knew personally was just as rewarding as any high-profile case. After a year, Jacob was offered a transfer, but by then, he knew he didn't want to leave. He had become a part of the community, deeply invested in both the people and the natural landscape. The local police were primarily responsible for protecting the residents, but with the village located within a national park, there was no ranger presence, nor any animal protection agency nearby. Over time, Jacob and the other officers took on a dual role, acting as protectors of both the people and the local wildlife. Living on the forest's edge, Jacob grew particularly attached to the animals he often encountered. He respected their space and learned to understand their behavior, becoming an unofficial guardian of the land and its creatures. But one night, this attachment would be tested like never before. Poachers had become a growing menace, sneaking into the national park to hunt illegally. Their methods were brutal. They didn't care if they left animals injured or in pain. Even worse, they wouldn't hesitate to harm anyone who tried to stop them. To the local police, the poachers were some of the most ruthless individuals they encountered. For Jacob, this wasn't just a professional challenge, it was a personal one. He had watched these animals, studied them, and even developed an understanding with some of them. Knowing they were in danger stirred a fierce determination in him to protect them. The thought of poachers tearing through the forest, hurting creatures he had come to care about, was unbearable. In the face of this threat, Jacob's role took on new significance. He realized he wasn't just a village cop, but a true steward of the land, with a duty to protect every living thing within it. The community had come to see him as more than just law enforcement. He was a bridge between the human and natural worlds, a role he embraced with pride and purpose. His commitment was now unwavering, fueled by a deep sense of responsibility for the land and its inhabitants. One night, Jacob was jolted awake by gunshots echoing from the forest. His heart raced as he grabbed his badge and gun, reporting the shots and calling for backup before heading into the woods. He knew the risks. Poachers were often heavily armed and rarely worked alone. Alone in the darkness, Jacob moved cautiously, his gun at the ready. The stakes were high, and with no immediate backup, he had to rely solely on his training and instincts. As he approached the clearing, a terrible sight unfolded before him. The poachers had injured a mother wolf, and to his horror, they were now aiming at her defenseless pups. Determined to protect the young wolves, Jacob sprang into action. Reaching into his vehicle, he switched on his powerful spotlight and directed its beam onto the poachers, momentarily stunning them in its blinding light. Startled, they froze, but the pause was brief. Within seconds, they retaliated, firing shots in his direction. Jacob ducked for cover, narrowly avoiding their bullets, but his interference had shaken them. Realizing they'd been exposed, the poachers quickly fled the scene. Jacob couldn't pursue them alone in the thick forest, so he turned his attention to the injured wolves. Approaching the mother wolf, his heart sank. She hadn't survived. Among her pups, one lay injured, bleeding heavily from a bullet graze. The young wolf was barely moving, and Jacob knew that if he didn't act quickly, the pup wouldn't survive. Carefully, he lifted the injured pup, feeling its weak pulse, and rushed back to his cabin to administer first aid. Once there, he used his emergency first aid kit to clean the wound and stitch it up as best as he could. The pup whimpered softly, but Jacob's steady hands and gentle murmurs seemed to calm it. Meanwhile, the other pups had retreated to their den, and he felt reassured knowing they were safe for the moment. A fellow officer arrived shortly after, and they calmed the area in an attempt to track the poachers. But they had vanished into the night, leaving no trace. The officers carefully collected the mother wolf's body, intending to retrieve the bullet lodged in her. This evidence would be sent to a forensic lab in the city, where they hoped it could help identify the poachers. For Jacob, though, the night wasn't over. He kept watch over the injured pup, tending to it with as much care as he could manage. The pup, though weak, showed a spark of resilience, and Jacob felt a powerful bond growing between them. The harrowing encounter left Jacob shaken but resolute. He vowed to pursue justice not only for the fallen mother wolf, but also for the entire wildlife community he had come to cherish. As dawn approached, Jacob found himself more determined than ever to protect the land and its creatures from those who sought to harm it. The injured pup's recovery was promising. Jacob noticed that, though the bullet had grazed the young wolf's leg, it hadn't hit anything critical. The main concern was blood loss, but with rest and nourishment, the pup would be fine. Inspired by the forest around them, Jacob began calling the little wolf Timber. Over the following days, he fed and cared for Timber, checking his wound daily and making sure he grew stronger. However, Jacob remained concerned about Timber's siblings, who were still hiding in their den. He visited the den regularly, leaving food and water outside to ensure they were cared for without overwhelming them. The pups were old enough to eat solid food, so he didn't worry about their nutrition but felt a duty to keep an eye on them. He even brought Timber along for his visits, allowing him to reunite and play with his siblings, strengthening their bond. Once Timber was strong enough, Jacob decided to let him stay with his family full-time, but Timber had other plans. The next morning, when Jacob stepped outside his cabin, he was greeted by a surprising sight. The wolf pups were curled up together, sound asleep on his porch. Timber had led his siblings to Jacob's doorstep, forming a trust that brought them closer than Jacob had anticipated. With the pups near his cabin, caring for them became easier. Jacob built them a large, cozy shelter nearby, giving them a safe place close to his own. Though most of the pups remained wary, allowing Jacob only to approach them when he brought food, Timber was different. The little wolf was unusually tame, adapting quickly to Jacob's care. When it was time to change Timber's bandages or remove his stitches, he stayed calm and still, as if he knew Jacob was helping him. Jacob respected the boundaries of the other pups, understanding that while they trusted him enough to stay nearby, they were still wild at heart. His role was to protect and care for them without forcing them into human closeness they didn't want. Timber, however, seemed to enjoy Jacob's company, forming a unique bond that went beyond mere dependence. Over time, Timber's gentle trust and the respect Jacob showed for the young wolves highlighted a rare friendship between man and nature, one rooted in mutual respect, care, and the freedom to live as they were meant to. As the wolves grew older, they also grew larger and more independent. Timber's leg healed completely, and one day, he and the rest of the pack ventured off into the forest. They didn't return right away. Days, and sometimes even weeks, would pass without a sight of them, but eventually, they always found their way back to Jacob's cabin. Over time, some of the wolves started families of their own. Many would bring their pups to the den Jacob had built, instinctively knowing it was a safe place to raise their young. Timber, especially, seemed to hold a special attachment to Jacob. Even as a mature wolf, he could often be found lounging near Jacob's door, waiting for a bit of affection and attention. It was this enduring connection that solidified Jacob's unique bond with the wolves of the region, a bond that, unbeknownst to him, would soon lead to a chilling discovery. Around this time, unsettling events began to ripple through the villages under the local police department's jurisdiction. Usually a peaceful place, the area was now facing an unusual spike in crime. Several shops had been broken into, supplies were stolen, and a few residents were even assaulted. Homes were ransacked, and belongings vanished mysteriously. The sudden wave of criminal activity concerned Jacob. In the past, any issues had been isolated to one village, making them relatively easy to handle. But now, the crime seemed to spread across multiple villages, putting an unusual strain on the small, understaffed police department. Jacob was deeply troubled. This was a place he considered his own, a peaceful community where people rarely had to worry about their safety. Now, with rising incidents, the villagers were becoming anxious, and so was he. The crimes weren't just unsettling, they posed a real danger. And the worst part was that Jacob had no clue what or who was behind it. The police department was small, responsible for overseeing multiple villages, and resources were stretched thin. Jacob and his team had to get creative to maintain a sense of security. They organized mobile patrols, allowing officers to cover more ground and keep an eye on several villages. Jacob and his partner were assigned one of these rotating patrols, traveling from village to village to ensure their presence was felt. Despite their best efforts, Jacob had no idea that the biggest challenge awaited them just outside one of the villages. Each patrol felt like a race against time, trying to prevent another incident before it happened, but the scope of the crimes seemed to outpace them. The rural peace Jacob had come to cherish was being eroded by an unknown threat lurking in the shadows, and he could feel that something larger, and far more dangerous, was just around the corner. The wolves' unexpected absence and their timely return began to feel like a sign, a reminder that danger didn't just lie in the forest, but was now creeping into the heart of the communities he had vowed to protect. Jacob and his partner were driving through the forest when they encountered an unusual sight. A pack of wolves, with Timber leading, stood firmly in the middle of the road, refusing to move. Their behavior struck Jacob as odd. He knew the wolves well enough to sense when something was wrong. Cautiously, he got out of the vehicle and approached them. Jacob was likely the only person who could do so, given the trust he'd built with these wild animals. Timber, recognizing him, stepped forward, gently tugging at Jacob's pant leg as if trying to guide him. Timber's urgency was unmistakable. Jacob's partner watched with a mix of curiosity and trust, understanding that if Jacob felt the wolves were trying to communicate something important, then it was worth following. They armed themselves and followed the pack into the dense forest. The wolves led them with purpose, moving steadily in one direction. It became clear they had a specific destination in mind, though what awaited them was still a mystery. After navigating through the forest, Jacob and his partner arrived at a hidden clearing, where they discovered a horrifying scene. Rows of cages held various captive animals, including a restless bear, wolf pups, and other wildlife. The area was littered with animal skins, knives, and stolen goods, linking the scene to recent village break-ins. Overcome with anger and sorrow, Jacob wanted to free the animals immediately but knew that waiting would help catch the poachers responsible. The officers set up a watch and a few hours later saw the poachers return with another injured animal. Once the poachers were settled, the team moved in, arresting them swiftly. Interrogating the poachers, Jacob and his team uncovered an extensive trafficking network, leading to more arrests and dismantling a major operation. Veterinarians were brought in to help the rescued animals. Some could be saved and were later released back into the wild. Jacob, however, handled the wolf pups' release personally. When he returned them to his cabin, the pack was waiting in his yard. As he opened the cage, the pups ran to their mother, who greeted them with joyful affection. For Jacob, this rescue was his proudest moment on the force. He had helped save lives, restore the forest's peace, and reunite a family, making it a day he would never forget.